Okay, good morning. We are doing today Yud Daled Amud Aleph, and we are on the last lines of Yud Gimel Amud Beis. Yeah, so yesterday what we had just discussed was the question about a Yachid who's doing Taanit Sibur. So where does he say Anenu? We had what the Gemara told us about halfway towards the second part of the page on Yud Gimel Amud Beis. So the Gemara said that Shalusha the Tanis Eichmet Karina. Where do you say the bracha of Anenu? So the Gemara initially thought that maybe you should say it Ben Gael and Raife, like what we do the extra bracha between Gael and Raife Chaylim. But we said, but how could it be? A Yachid is going to be kaveh a bracha for himself. So the Gemara said, well, maybe you say it by Shemei Tefillah. And in fact, Rav Shesha said that we say the bracha of Anenu by Shemei Tefillah. Then the Gemara asked the question. Meisvei said the Gemara, Ein ben Yachal et Tzibur. She said there's no difference between a Yachal and a Tzibur except that the Yachal says 18 brachas, and the Tzibur, which we thought initially meant the Shlich Tzibur, then we went back, it's maybe meant something else, that they say 19 brachas, meaning we're not including here the bracha of the Tztukim. Obviously, the bracha of the Tztukim is an additional bracha, but let's just pretend that that's not relevant for the moment. So a regular Yachid, when he has a fast day, he says 18 brachas, because Anenu by him is only going into Shemei Tefillah. He's not adding a separate bracha for Anenu. Whereas for the Shlech Tzibur, when he's taking over, when he's saying over to Shemon Esrei to himself, when he's saying over to Shemon Esrei, Chazaras Tashatz, so he doesn't say 18 brachas, he says 19, because between Gael, Yisrael, and Reifei Chaylim, he adds in an additional bracha, the bracha of Anenu. Fine. That skip down now to sort of the wide lines here, which is where we got up to yesterday. And the Gemara basically just ended up saying that we're at this stage thinking that that's the difference. Now it says the Gemara, one second. The Kakash Lachash, that Tzibur Esrim Varba Masli, Begimel Tainus Rishonis, the Leka Esrim Varba, right? But and what we're saying is that the 24 brachas is not relevant. And just explaining it from yesterday, there is at the last stage of the tiny ice, 24 brachas that are said. We're going to see, not here, but we're going to see, this is Wednesday, Thursday. On Thursday, the beginning of the parak, of the second parak, over there, if you look in the Mishnah on Tezvav, you'll see that the Mishnah says that when you get to the third series of fasts, you say over there 24 brachas. You say the regular 18 brachas. Then you have an extra 6 brachas. That is in the third series of fasts. Right? Remember, there's the first 3 fasts that you fast when there's no rain, second 3 fasts when you fast there's no rain, and then there's a third series of fasts, 7 fasts when the rain still does not come. So again, at this stage of the Gemara, where we're starting today, is that the Gemara said that we think that the difference between a Yachid and a Tzibur is that by a Yachid there's 18 brachas because Anenu goes into Shemei Tefillah, and by the Shliach Tzibur there's 19 brachas. Why? Because there's an additional bracha between Goyal and Reifei Chaylim of Anenu, which is in fact, as Taisus pointed out, how we paskin. Okay, and we're going to see again in the Gemara later on about this today. So Fred Zok the Gemara. Velai, are you saying that really this is the only difference between the tightness of the Shmonesha by a Yachid and by the Tzibur? Velai, v'ha'ein bein katani. We said that there's a lashon of ein bein, right? Like in the Gemara's in Megillah, right? Or in Barachas, we have the whole paragraph of ein beins. What does it mean when you say ein bein? There's no difference except. Usually that sounds like I'm telling you what the difference is. There's no difference between X and Y except for this. Well, I mean, except for that, then you probably mean it b'dafka. If I'm telling you there's no difference between X and Y except for this, probably you mean it. Not that there's a million other differences. You're telling me there's no other difference. If you want to tell me that there's a difference between X and Y, you say X is this and Y is that. But if you say there's no differences between X and Y except for this, then presumably it's b'dafka, and there really aren't any other differences. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. But doesn't it say Ein Ben that there's no difference between X and Y? Ein Ben Gimel Rishonis the Gimel Emtsoyes. There's no difference between the first set of 3 fasts and the second set of 3 fasts. ube'elu asur masias malacha, except by the first series of 3 fasts. It's mutter to go to work, and by the second series of 3 fasts, it's asur masias malacha. What does that mean? If we say that there's no difference between the first sets of 3 fasts and the second set of 3 fasts, except for the fact that the first one is mutter malacha and the second one is not mutter malacha, what's the mashmayis? The mashmayis is that's the difference. And what would it come out when it's dealing with going to work? Most likely what? Most likely going to work is not a difference. If you're saying ein bein gimel rishonis the gimel emtzayis, and the only difference is working, that by the first one it's mutter to work, and by the second one it's not mutter to work, then the mashmayis is that when it comes to the 24 brachas, there's no difference between the first sets of 3 fasts and the second set of 3 fasts. You didn't mention it. Says the Gemara, Halachav Dal, it's mashma that when it comes to the 24 brachas, that there's no difference. There's no difference between these first sets of 3 fasts and the second set of 3 fasts. Says the Gemara now, a classic answer to piss throughout Shas, Tana v'Shier. No, Ein Bain, don't ask me any questions. Ein Bain is what? Telling you there's no difference between the first and the second sets of 3 fasts. And here we seem to be just focused on malacha, but he left out some things. What did he leave out? This idea of the 24 brachas. The 24 brachas he also left out. Meaning that what? It's true by the first set of 3 fasts there's no 24 brachas, only 19. But the second set is 24, it's okay. He left it out. It says Ein Bain. So says the Gemara. You're telling me that that's your style answer. The Gemara does something that it does all the time whenever it says Tana v'Shiyah. Says the Gemara, my shire, the high shire. What else did it leave out? If you're saying that it left out something, then I want to know that it left out something else. It will be really odd and really like too perfect to say, oh, he said all the differences except for this particular one. Come on. If you're going to say he left something out, then he at least had to leave out 2 things, not just one thing. The perfect one that you needed for this moment. That's the my shire, the high shire, visu, and more than that. Well, ain't bank it, honey. I just don't like the idea of you telling me that he's leaving out stuff when it didn't just say a memra. He said ain't bain. Ain't bain is mashim a very bedafka type of a lashon. So the Gemara answers, no, I can find you something else that he left out. Do you know what he left out? Elatana be'isuri kamari b'tfilas kamari. I could tell you. So the Gemara gives 2 answers. First answer is, you're asking me a question that's inapposite. You're asking me a question that's not relevant. Why? Because the Tana is dealing with Isser. He's not dealing with Tfilas. In other words, you're asking me a question. You're saying, well, it says Ein Bain. Oh, if it says Ein Bain, then it had to list every possible permutation that would be different. It says Ein Bain, there's no difference between the first series of 3 fasts and the second series of 3 fasts, except for, well, you better give me a list of everything. It says, well, I don't give you a list of everything. Well, what are we talking about when we're saying Ein Bain? We're talking about tefillas or we're talking about Isser v'Heter stuff? We're talking about davening. We were talking about Isser v'Heter. So what does it mean when we said Ein Bain? We meant we are not talking about tefillas. We're just talking about malacha. So the first series of 3 fasts you could work. The second series of 3 fasts you cannot work. Part 2, you want to tell me, oh, but there's also a difference in tefillas. Then in the second series of fasts, you say 24 brachas, and the first series of 3 fasts, the Shech Tzibur only says 19. We're not talking about tefillas here. When we said Ein Bain, we were talking about Isser v'Heter. That is the first answer of the Gemara. So your question about my shire, the high shire, not a question. We're not talking about tefillas. It's not like he left it. He didn't leave it. Ein Bain, Ein Bain didn't mean on every possibility. Ein Bain meant in relation to Isser v'Heter. We're talking about there's no difference in the first and second series of 3 fasts except for working. But we weren't talking about tefillas. Ein Bain should be understood in a limited way as it related to Isser v'Heter issues, not as it related to every possible permutation of what might be different between the first and second of 3 fasts. That is the Vermar's first answer. The Gemara gives a second answer. What's the second answer? B'emtziusa Nami le'matlichav daled. The second answer of the Gemara is that by the second series of three fasts, there is not 24 brachas. When do we say the 24 brachas by the Chazan in the Chazaras Hashatz? Only by the third series of 7 fasts, not by the middle series of 3 fasts. So now, right, we're now coming out with big armor. Right? We're now challenging the whole proposition. You're telling me, oh, well, how could you say Ein Bain? You forgot the fact that in the middle fast, he does 24 brachas, and by the first, he doesn't. First series of 3 fasts, he only says the 19. And you forgot to mention that. So I didn't forget to mention anything. There's no 24 brachas by the Chazaras Hashatz of the second series of 3 fasts. The 24 brachas only comes up in the third series of 7 fasts. So, and that answer of the Gemara is a much more powerful answer. I'm not now saying, oh, well, in Bain, he only did Isser v'Heter, he's not doing tefillas. No. There's no 24 brachas by the series of second fast. There is no 24 brachas for Chazaras Hashatz, only 19. This is a much more powerful answer. Because this now Retzim Zach. No, he was exactly with Dafka. Ein Bain, there is no difference. There is no 24 brachas, period. Good? So at this stage of the Gemara, says the Gemara, really? There's no 24 brachas by the second series of 3 fasts? Is that really true? But we learned in a brayso, Ein Bain Gimel Shnias. L'Sheva Achreines, there's no difference between the second series of 3 fasts and the 7 fasts of the third series. Except by the last series of 7 fasts, the third series of fasts. Over there, we close up the stores and we sound the alarm. And everything else, they're going to be the same. In other words, what's the difference between the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts? Sounds like the only difference is that in the third series of 7 fasts, we sound the alarm and we close all the stores. But in every other area, it's the same. And therefore what? Mashma, when it comes to the 24 brachas, so the Shiach Tzibur would say by the Chazaras Hashatz, it's the same. So it's mashma that it's not something new that comes up in the third series of 7 fasts, but they're saying 24 brachas by the Chazaras Hashatz in the second series of 3 fasts. Says the Gemara, no. Says the Gemara, maybe you're going to say, well, maybe he left it out. So I'm going to tell you, but didn't he write Ein Bain? Don't we take that seriously? And that Ein Bain means there really is no difference between the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts. And if there was a difference in terms of the fact that we're going to say 24 brachas by the third series and not by the second series, he should have mentioned it. Says I'll ask you even more. Ein Bain Dafka. You want to tell me that Ein Bain is B'Dafka? Let's turn the page now to Yudalim and Aleph. V'Hoshir Teva. But we left out something. What do we leave out? We leave out the Teva, right? That they would bring out the Aron Kodesh to the middle of the street. They did that by the third series of fasts. By the 7 fasts of the third series, the Mamash brought out the Aron Kodesh into the street. So we didn't talk about that. And if you're saying Ein Bain Gimel Shnias L'Sheva Achronis Al Shebeil Masrim V'Nelas Achanuyos, you're saying Halachol difference Shavin, everything else is the same, and you're going to include in that the sameness that it has to be that the 24 brachas is also being said by the second series of 3 fasts. What about the Teva? What about the Aron? You didn't mention that. That should, according to what you're saying, then that would also be in the second series of 3 fasts, and it's not. It only comes up in the third series of 7 fasts. So Elamai, what then is that going to tell you? That's going to stop hacking me at shining on the Ein Bain. There's things that we left out. We left out the table. We left out the 24 fasts. Those are only things that apply by the third series of 7 fasts. Doesn't apply by the second series of 3 fasts. Says the Gemara, Imisham Teva Lav Shiur. Says no. I'm not accepting this, says the Gemara. Because the Teva, leaving out the Teva as one of the differences, that's not called a Shiur. That's not called leaving it out. Why? Because Mila de Tzinikatani, Mila de Farhasia like Tani. Because we only talked about Mila de Tzina. We're not talking about Mila de Farhasia. And over here you have to understand that it's counterintuitive. When we're saying Mila de Tzina, we're talking about what you do in shul. Mila de Farhasia is what you do in the street. So Mila de Farhasia is the Aron Kodesh in the street. We're not talking about Farhasia. Normally, what do we say? We say that when it comes to being in shul, right? Where is it better to hear the Megillah? In your house? A very nice landing. Yeah, mamish, beautiful. Not going to be any questions of hearing. Haman, you're going to hear everything perfect. Gorgeous landing in shul. I'm sorry, in the home. But in shul, there's going to be people with some firecrackers. If you didn't hear Haman, well, what do you say? Where's it better to hear the laning? Why? Pirsumi Nisa. What do we always say? What's in shul? Is a pirsum. It's a baravam hadis melech. What do we always mashma that in shul is what? That's called the farhesia. Here we're saying the opposite. Shul here is called betzina. The street is called befarhesia. Okay, so when it comes to the shul, and look at Rashi, mil detzina is masrim v'esakneses. Right, the fact that we're sounding the alarm in the shul, the chavdal brachas that the shech tzibur is saying, those are all called b'vesakneses betzina. There's a minion, everybody's there. No, that's all betzina. But the teva in the street, that's b'farhasia. So what's the Gemara's answer? Says the Gemara, listen, you don't bring me a raya about the teva, that they didn't mention the fact that there's no difference in the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts, and we didn't mention that there's a difference between the fact that you take the Aron out by the last series and not by the intermediate series. Says the Gemara, that's not a raya, because that's mila b'farhasia. We're b'chalal not talking about that. We're only talking about mila ditzina. We're always about private things. So therefore, you can't ask me a question on it. So if you can't ask me a question on the teva, then where are we back to? Right? Where are we back to? We're back to our question. Right? If we're back to our question, then about why is it that we're going to say that the 24 brachas is only by the third series and not by the second? Why would we leave out only that one? If that's the only distinction, because the teva is not considered a real distinction, because that's mil differhencia, so then the only example you're showing me that's different is with regards to the 24 brachas. Now you want to tell me the 24 brachas is what you say only by the third, not by the second, but you said ain't bain. So therefore the Gemara says, Amar Abashi, Masnisa Nami Deka, our Mishnah is also a raya, Dektani, because our Mishnah told us, and here we have a bit of a different gear. So if you go back to Yudal on a base, Yud on a base. If you go back for a second, look at the Mishnah there on Yud on a base. The Mishnah says, "Harei elu yiseris al arishonis." Right here, we're talking about. If you remember, we're talking about the series of 3 different fasts. Right. So the Mishnah said again, just to remind everybody, "Avru elu v'loy nenu." Right. What happens if if you look at the beginning of the Mishnah, "Avru elu v'loy nenu," the first series of 3 fasts, for the lack of rain, have gone by. V'loy nenu, they weren't answered. So then, based on what's Gezer Gimel Taanit Acheres, the new series of 3 fasts, and by the second series of 3 fasts, what happens if the second series of 3 fasts passed and still no rain? So basically, Gezer Oit Sheva. Bezdin now is Gezer them another 7 fasts. This is the last series, right? The third series of 7 fasts. And Gimel Taanit, that becomes now 13. Right, you have the 3 first, the 3 second, and now the 7 third, which gives you 13 fasts. Harei elu yiseris al arishonis. This third are more than the first series. Shebe elu masriyim v'neil sakaniyos. Because by these you make a sounding the alarm and you close the stores. Now the version, if you look on the Sar Meseres Hashas, the version that we have in our Mishnah is Harei elu. But if you look here at the Gemara, clearly on Yudal had a different girsa, and that's what they put in, which is that the lashon of the Mishnah should be ma elu yiseris elushanis. Why are these? How are these different? And what are these different than the previous series? The previous series did not have masrin, did not have sounding the alarm, and did not have shutting the stores. Right? We had shutting the mechatzoyes in the second series, but we didn't have shutting the stores. Right? A general close down of the whole life of the town. So now the Gemara says like this. So Rav Ashi is adding. We now said that the difference between the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts cannot be used the teva as a difference because that's the milta for Hesed. We're not discussing that. So now Rav Ashi adds as follows: Amar Rav Ashi, Masnisa Nami Deka. Our Mishnah is also a raya. Diktani Ma'elu Yisrael Salavishanis, because our Mishnah said, in what way are this series, the third series of 7 fasts, more different than the previous 2 series of 3 fasts? Because over here we're going to sound the alarm and shut the stores. But it's mashma that the difference then is this: they're shutting the stores, sounding the alarm. But as regards to everything else, it's mashma that it wouldn't be different. Mashma that it would be equal. It would be the same. Says no, if you're going to say, you know what? Let's answer what we said before, Tana V'Shier, that, you know what, he left it out. Stop bugging me about this 24. He left it out. Says the Gemara, no, didn't he say what's the difference between the third series of 7 fasts and the second series of 3 fasts? In what way is it different? We said it's sounding the alarm and shutting the stores. Says Dafka, right? Who you're going to understand ma'elu as mamish being so bedafka, but then they leave out the teva. So again, as Taisus points out here, we could say, well, teva is not relevant because the teva is a milah for Hesia. But the Gemara says, imisham teva lav shiru, the teva is not considered a shiura. Again, not for what we just said before, but now for a new reason. Why? Because we're going to literally talk about the teva in the next parak. If you look here again on Daf Tesva for a moment, the opening line of the Mishnah of the second parak is say the Taanit Ketzad. Right? How do you deal with the last series of 7 fasts, the third series of 7 fasts? You put out the aron in the middle of the city. So we dealt with it. We already going to deal with it. So it's not called a shear. You can't tell me, oh, he left it. He's literally dealing with it in the next parak. That's not called a shear. So if it's not called a shear, then what? So then then teva is not something that's being left out. If teva is not something that's being left out, then what do we in fact have? What else are we discussing? Again, we're back to the 24 fasts. So says the Gemara, you already dealt with it in the next parak. So says the Gemara, so now you're telling me that we're stuck because we only have the 24 and ma'elu, and so therefore we're going to have to force to say that there is no difference in the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts, that they both must have the Shech Sibah saying 24 brachas? No. Says the Gemara, your answer now shows me why 100% this is not a distinction. There is no distinction between the 24 brachas. You can't ask me a distinction between the 24 brachas that there should be said by the second series just like by the third. Why? Because we also talk about the 24 brachas in the second parak. Look in the second parak again on Daf Tesvav for a second. As we mentioned earlier, what does it say in the middle of the Mishnah there? It says, V'omer lifnei, about 7 or 8 lines down, V'omer lifnei and esrim v'arba brachas. He says it. He says over here that we're going to do 24 brachas by the third series of 7 fasts. So once he's saying that you say over 24 brachas by the third series of 7 fasts, so don't say that when it's in the Mishnah on Yud Beis, ma'elu, that we're being bedafka, that it's not bedafka. He's going to come to it in a page. So if he's going to come to it in a page, so then don't ask me a kasha that should be like the second series and the third series both have to have 24 brachas on a Shech Tzibur. It's not true. The third series has it. He makes it clear on Daf Tesvav. And on Daf Yud Beis, he's just simply talking about one of the distinctions about Noilan as a Chanuyos, Masrian. That's it. But in terms of the 24 brachas, of course, that's the distinction that he will deal with in the second parak. The teva he will deal with in the second parak. Right? So in other words, the idea that the teva was a problem, which we tried to initially say, oh, well, maybe the teva and the chavdal are different. One's b'farasia, one's b'tzina. And the end of the Gemara says, no, that's not the way to look at it. both of these issues of the Teva and the Tchav Daled Brachas, which are by the third series of 7 fasts, both of those are dealt with in the second parak in literally a couple of pages. Therefore, the fact that the Mishnah, when it started dealing with the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 7 fasts, and it made a comment that you thought maybe meant Bedafka, like what's the difference between the second and the third series? Well, the difference sounds like from the Mishnah is only in relation to closing the stores, only in relation to sounding the alarm, and there's no other distinctions. It's just simply you're too precocious. You're too much of a Bedafkanik. It's not such a big deal. We literally in the next Mishnah, I mean, forget the Gemara. Imagine from the structure of the Mishnayos. It's literally the next Mishnah. Right? For us, it's a few pages in the Gemara, but it's really just the next Mishnah. That's it. Once you say that's it, it's not such a big deal, then what does it come out? Then you cannot bring me any kasha about the fact that there's a difference between Ein Ben Yachid and Tzibor, that the Yachid says 18 and he says 19. Why? Because it's going to come out, according to the second answer of the Gemara, that there is a difference between the second series of 3 fasts and the third series of 3 fasts. Namely, that the second series of 3 fasts doesn't have 24 brachas either. So now it's going to come out what? That it's perfect. You could 100% say either with a ton of a sheer kind of an idea, or you could say there isn't even 24 brachas by the second series of 3 fasts. So therefore, when it comes out that the difference in Yachid and Tzibur, what we're talking about is the Yachid has 18 brachas because he says, Aneinu and Shemei Tefillah, and the Shech Tzibur in his Chazars Hashatz, he has 19 brachas because he makes the bracha of Aneinu between Goyal and Reifei. And that's in fact how the Gemara concludes this bit. Good? I know it's a bit of a third series, second series, but the basic halting kav is the Gemara is proving that you're reading too strongly into the Mishnah. When I mamish have the next Mishnah going to cover off on some of the distinctions between the second and the third series, and so therefore don't ask me, so strongly about the lashon in the last Mishnah, the first paragraph about ma'elu. Okay, good, fine. So now let's move on. The Gemara here now concludes just the nola halach al ma'aseh. How do we do this? So the Gemara says like this: Hash the asas lahachi. Now, I'm sorry, we just read that. Hash the asas lahachi asked from Abba Nami Lav Shiru. Diktani law be'idach perka. Fine. So says the Gemara, my havala. So in fact, how do we paskin? Right now that we've said all this, how in fact do we paskin? Where do we say anenu? Rav Shmuel bar Sasrete, v'chein Rav Chia bar Ashi. So Rav Shmuel bar Sasrete and Rav Chia bar Ashi say in the name of Rav, Ben Goyal l'Reifei, that they do it where? Between Goyal and Reifei. Not like what we said before in your big Gimel and Beis, but rather even the Yachid says it between Goyal and Reifei, meaning is that he would also have 19 brachas. We do it in fact by Shemei Tefillah, and that's in fact how we do it. We don't do it between Goyal and Reifei, that's only the Shliach Tzibur. And Tosfos, I think I mentioned yesterday that Tosfos pointed out that why do we do it for the Shliach Tzibur, Ben Goyal v'Reifei? So the reason is to, in part, let the people know, right? To make sure that there's going to be that everybody's aware that there's a fast day, and there's always going to be someone fasting. Yeah. I just wanted to mention because of the Sunday classes that we're doing now about the formation of the Talmud. So we talked this week, right? We spent half the time talking about Mar Bar Avashi, and we talked about the hundreds of places in Shas where Mar Bar Avashi comes out. So how that dealt with whether or not Ravina or Rav Ashi would have said or were the final editors of the Talmud, right? But here in the Gemara we're mentioning Rav Chia bar Ashi. Right? Rav Chia bar Ashi is not a son of Rav Ashi. Just want to be very clear. Right? First of all, you would know that. Why? How do you know that for sure? Without knowing without being an expert, you can know it from 2 hints from the Gemara. Right? One is what? Oh, that's exactly right. It says Rav Chia bar Ashi. It will be Rav Ashi. Right? What do we say about Rav Elazar Rav Shimon? Do you say Rav Elazar Rav Shimon? No, it's Rav Elazar ben Rav Shimon. Right? You don't just say his name. So you would say Rav Chia bar Rav Ashi. That's number one. Number two, what's the second proof that you know? Rav Chia bar Ashi here is quoting who? He's quoting Rav. right? It's quoting Rav. Yes, it's quoting Rav, right? So Rav is obviously from the first generation of Amram, Tanu Polik, right? So it cannot be that he will be quoting Rav if he was from a generation after Rav Ashi's sons, the fourth, it would be the fifth generation of an Amar. It would just simply be impossible to imagine that kind of ability to quote him. Right? I'll just let you in on one thing because it's too juicy to let it go. The Gemara in the end of Kedushin on Pei Aleph, the Gemara there discusses a few unbelievable stories. Look over there. I don't want to get off on the topic, and all of a sudden the time ran away, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But if you look down the Gemara, you'll see about the various rabbis who used to be mislesis but Yetzirah, and they got into trouble as a result of their making fun of the Yetzirahs and not taking it too seriously. Kiva, a whole bunch of stories. If you look down the Gemara says the story about the demise of Reb Chibar Ashi, and the Gemara says over there that he used to be very afraid of the Varavera, and his wife dressed up as a Zaina in order to entice him, and he was enticed, and he felt so bad that he jumped into an oven and could, at least maybe according to one understanding of the Gemara, some of the versions of the Gemara, different sort of manuscripts, it could be he died in that oven. Others say no. He the rest of his life he lamented the fact that he thought he was being mizana, even though it was his wife. Nevertheless, the rest of his life he was always in like mourning, crying about the fact that his mind he had a das to do something wrong, even though he didn't. Nevertheless, all right, that's Rav Chia Bar Ashi's unfortunate end there in the Gemara in Kedushin and Pei Aleph on the base. Okay, so now we have a new Gemara. Yeah, so Zog the Gemara. Tani Chada, we have one brisa that tells us Ubrois umenikos misanos berishonos. Pregnant women, nursing women, are fasting on the first series of 3 fasts. Ve'im misanos ba'achronos, and they're not fasting on the presumably second series of 3 fasts. Now remember, we are talking about 3 series of fasts. So I just read it to you. Is that correct? When I was saying the first and the second, what about the third? Is the third one here at all? The Tani Idach, we have another brisa that says that the Ubris and Menikas and Misanis Ba'achrenes, they're fasting on the second, presumably, series of 3 fasts, but Misanis Ba'achrenes, but they don't fast on the first series of 3 fasts. So it sounds like we got already a stira. And then with Tani Idach, we have a third brisa that says, Ein Misanis Loy Ba'achrenes Loy Ba'achrenes. They do not fast not on the first series of 3 fasts and not on the second series of 3 fasts. So what are we doing? How do you answer up all these 3 brises? They all seem to be contradicting one another. Says the Gemara, Amar of Ashi, I have a simple teretz for you. Nokit emtziusa b'yadchot mitaratzin lekulu. All these 3 brises are talking about the second series of 3 fasts. And if they're all talking about the second series of 3 fasts, it answers up everything. How's that? Now look carefully. If we say in the first brise, what does that mean? That means we're talking here about the Rishainos Legabe the Achronis, meaning we're talking about the second series of 3 fasts as opposed to the third. So here we're saying that they are Masana, which would mean that they're fasting on the second series. They fast on the first and second series. And then the second verse that says Masanas Ba'achronis and Masanas B'Rishainos, that they're fasting on the last series, but not on the first series. That's talking about the second as opposed to the first. And look at the third verse, Masanas, Loy B'Rishainos, Loy B'Achronis. We're talking about the first versus they're not fasting. Loy B'Rishainos, Veloy B'Achronis. What we mean to say is that they are not fasting on the first series of the 3 fasts because that's not like a big deal yet, right? And they're not fasting on the last series of the third series of the 7 fasts. They're only fasting in the middle. So it comes out then that according to all 3 brises, everyone agrees that the Ubris and Menikas are fasting when? Not on the first series of 3 fasts, not on the last third series of 7 fasts. They're only fasting on the middle series, the second series of 3 fasts, when it's already more serious. So the first series of 3, it's not such a big deal. The last series of 7 is too much to fast. There's too many things. But the middle series of 3, that's somewhat doable, and therefore they have to do that. And that would answer it up. I want to point out over here, we have limited time, that this is, for me, one of the big rayas, that Rashi is not, as the Mahatzchias told us on base, is not Rashi in Taanit. Right, again, if you look at all these tests in here on this page and the last page I didn't have time to do, you look at all the tests that say Pirish, Pirish, Pirish. Again, that's our classic raya, one of our many. But here, if you look at this Taisus here, and Taisus different maskal Tani Chada, look how Taisus opens it up. Taisus says Pirish Bekuntris. And what does he say? Pirish Bekuntris. Hasholish Tanias Em Tsoyis Biyadcha. What we end up talking about is the second series. That's what the whole thing is going on. And then Taisus continues, the Bais and Tiny Ubers Manikas Misanas, the middle series of the three fasts, that's when the Ubers and Manikas are being Misana. And this is what Rashi is trying to tell you. And then he explains the whole Rashi. I don't have time to go into it now, but it's what I just said outside. But look at Rashi, Nakim Mitziusa Beyadcha. You'll see the whole Arichas. It's literally the whole Rashi. So what does it must mean? It must mean when Taisus in Pirish HaKuntris, Taisus only had a Rashi that had a very short 2 lines, a classic Rashi. That's it. Now Taisus is adding in. What did Rashi mean? But over here in our Rashi, we have a whole arichos. Literally, the whole Taisus is here. That's a huge raya that the Rashi that we ended up with, like Mariskia said, is from the students of Rashi, from the yeshiva of Rashi, but not Rashi himself, because literally it makes no sense why Taisus would quote Rashi and then expand to explain Rashi with the whole V'achik Gomer when we have the whole Rashi literally here. Good? All right, last bit of the Gemara for today. Zod the Gemara. Ma elu yaseris ala rishonis. What's the difference between the last series of the 3 fasts versus the earlier fast? Al she'elu masrin v'noah sachanuyas. Right? We make the sound in the alarm and we close the store. It says the Gemara, b'may masrin. How do you sound the alarm? Rehuda Amar b'shayfers. Rehuda b'rei Rav Shmuel bar Shelat. Mishmei derav Amar ba'anenu. You do the alarm by saying anenu. Taisus here quotes the Ri, which literally says exactly what Rashi says, which is the anenu that we're talking about here is not the anenu between Goel v'Roifid, not the anenu he's saying Shemei, not that anenu, because that we say by the first fast, even by the first series of 3 fasts we say anenu. So what are we talking about anenu? It's the anenu of slichos. The anenu that you say at the end of the whole slichos, anenu Hashem anenu, anenu l'kevram anenu, that anenu, that's what we're talking about. They had the same version of slichos that we have today, back in the times of the Talmud, they also had anenu. So that's how you sound the alarm, by saying anenu. Says the Gemara. I would have thought to say, whenever the Gemara in Shas says kosal k'daitach, that means it's always a havamina, right? And not a maskana. So kosal k'daitach, man de amar ba'anenu loy amar b'shayfer is the one the amar who says that you sound the alarm by saying anenu. That's what you're not saying it by shayfer is, meaning you're not sounding the alarm by blowing the shayfer. And the Mandar who says that you're sounding the alarm by blowing the shofar, you're not saying it by anenu. Tanya, the Gemara says that can't be. That can't be. Why not? Because we know that you do not do less than 7 tanesim for the tzibur. That has in there 18 alarms. As Taisus, Rashi both explain. What do you mean when you say it has all these alarms? Because what do you do by the third series of 7 fasts? We said instead of having 19 brachas, you have 24, right? So you're adding in, essentially, you're adding in 6 new brachas, right? These 6 new brachas that you're adding in, right, from 18 to 24, by each one of those, you blow shofar. And as Rashi points out, like Gemara Rosh Hashanah tells us, whenever you blow trua, what do you have to have before trua? A tkiya. And after trua, you have to have a tkiya. So that means you have 18 blasts, because you have 6 new brachas, and you're blowing shofar by each, a trua. Each one means 3 blasts. So 6 times 3, you have 18. So says the Gemara, it cannot be that you're going to tell me that the 18, that these series, the third series of 7 fasts, is going to be a situation where you have the 18 blowing of the shofar, that is not the alarm. That's everybody agrees that that's the alarm. Says the similar davar Yerichai, and we have a similar to that is Yerichai. Rashi doesn't really explain, but Taisus explains by Yerichai. What happened was they went around the city every day and they blew shofar, and on the last day they blew shofar 7 times. On the 7th day, and the whole walls collapsed. So the same thing is over here. So it says the Gemara, Yerichai shofars have it by Yerichai they blew shofar. So it's a tiyufta according to Mandam holds that the way that sound the alarm is only by anenu. No, el b'shofar to kuli amalei pligi de karli asra. Everybody agrees that the alarm is blowing the shofar. Nobody disagrees with that. Ki pligi b'anenu. There is a dispute when it comes to the saying of anenu. In other words, everybody agrees that how do you sound the alarm, right? Noel and masrin. What is the alarm that you sound in the third series of 7 fasts, blowing shofar. Everyone agrees with that. No one doubts that. There is a machlekes b'anenu. Myself, some say that is also considered a type of alarm. And some say no, that's not considered a type of an alarm. According to Madam Mo says that ba'anenu, that's considered a type of an alarm. Of course, b'shofar is going to be considered an alarm as well. And according to Madam Mo holds that only shofar is considered an alarm. But maybe they hold that anenu would not be sufficient to be considered an alarm. Says the Gemara, but I learned in a brisa. What about all sorts of other perennials that can come on a person or a community? Right? Exactly what that is, some sort of a scab. Chagav is a grasshopper. Zvuv is flies. Tir is hornets. Yitushin is more flies. V'shilach nechashim akram against snakes and scorpions. And all of these things, what do we say? Lo yehoyu masriin al tzoykin. In all those type of dangerous situations, they would not be masriya. They would not sound the alarm. Rather, what they do instead, they will be tzoykin. They will be crying out instead. Miditzaka bepeh. From that shows you that tzaka is with your mouth. That's with crying with your mouth. Nasras b'shayfaros. That sounding the alarm is with a shofar. So this is not a good proof then to show you that there's a difference. And when you say masriyan, it has to be with a shofar, and that when you do tzoykin, that's with a peh. So therefore, anenu is not considered type of sounding the alarm. So the Gemara says, Tanai, it's really a machlekes Tanaim. There are those, in fact, who hold that anenu could be an alarm. And what is that? The Tanakh gets a brayso that says, Al Masim Shabbos. We do have a situation where you sound the alarm on Shabbos. Al Ir Shekifu Gayas, an army surrounding the town, or maybe there's a river that's overflowing, or you have a ship that's having trouble. Rabbi Yossi says that you're able to sound the alarm only for help, but not just simply to cry out. Bimai, what is this dispute here between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanakama? Elam b'shofar. Are you going to say the dispute is about shofar? Shofar is b'Shabbos mishari. Is the shofar on Shabbos mutter? Elav ba'anenu. What we're talking about is obviously ba'anenu, the karli asra, and you see, nevertheless, it's still called an asra. So shmaminu, there is at least an opinion that holds that anenu could be considered a type of an alarm. I just want to point out that obviously we're not talking about here about sakanas nefashos. Because if it would be, of course, you could sound the shofar. We're talking about a situation where it wasn't sakanas nefashos. All right, I'll stop here.